Hi guys, welcome back. This is Professor Hank, and in this video I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the MVC architecture, the design pattern known as Model View Controller. Okay, so let's dig into it. What is this? What is it? What is MVC? It's a three-layered architecture that is used for organizing the code in your app. So this is a popular strategy for, or popular architecture for such things as Android apps or for designing complicated web systems, desktop apps, you name it, it's used. And it's very popular. And it's just a way for you to logically, it's a guide, it's a suggestion, it's a best practice for logically organizing your code. So let's take a look at a diagram of it. So the diagram shows that there's these three key components: view, controller, model. And as you can see from the labels there, anything that is considered a view component or part of the view component is something that has to do with the UI, the user interface, or elements of the user interface. They could be buttons, checkboxes, text fields, text boxes, spinners, whatever. You name it, it can be there. So if it has an interaction with the user could click on a button, the user could be presented with some data, some output, then it's considered part of the view. It falls under the umbrella of the view component. Right now, the controller component is the place where all of the logic that makes your app goes. So, your business logic, the different rules for how the app works. So, when a user pushes a button on the screen, then that's going to send an event to somewhere, and there has to be a method that encapsulates the logic for responding to that button press. And so that method could belong to a class that's considered to be part of the controller component. Okay? And then finally, you've got the model, which is responsible for data storage. So you could think of like a database. Okay, so a class that controls a database, those would be things that would be part of the model component. Now, if you take a look at the arrows there, what those are designating is the flow of information, message passing, data moving data around, that sort of thing. So, if you start with the user up here at the top, and let's say they push a button, so that's an interaction with something that belongs to the view. So then that button would send a message to the controller via a method call, maybe, right? Where the controller then could execute a method that would have logic that then would invoke a method in a model component, sending a message there saying, hey, store this data, and then the model would do that. And then could be the case that later on, the user pushes the button that says, hey, show me that data that I stored. Okay, and so then the controller would have logic for processing that request. It would send a message to the model through a method call that says retrieve that data. Then that data would be retrieved by an entity within the model, and that data would get returned back to the controller, who then would forward it on to the view, who then would display it to the user. So there's no direct communication between the view and the model. Okay, so it's a logical grouping of components that make up your software. All right, so let's look at a simple CRUD implementation of it, just so you can see that theory in practice. All right, so there we go. So what I'll do is I'll create three namespaces, and each namespace is going to represent one of those pieces. Right, so we'll have namespace view, and in here you'll define everything UI related will be part of the view component, part of the view package, part of the view namespace. Okay, then we'll have the model. Okay, and this is going to have everything that is storage related. Okay, think of it that way. And then we'll have the controller component. Okay, and this is going to be namespace everything that is logic related. Okay, so I mean like the main logic of the program. Sometimes you refer to that as the business logic. Okay, so let's start off with the view. Now in this app, it's just going to be simple. It's going to be a few classes that can illustrate the separation of responsibilities of each component and the flow of data in between the different components, the messaging and the actual data moving around itself. And so remember, messaging just means method calls in this example. Okay, so we'll need a class that's going to have the UI elements in it. So I'll just call that class UI. And this is just going to have three methods, three public methods. Okay, so we'll have a method for prompting the user. Okay, and one of those will just put a string on the screen. So cout s. Okay, I know that that method goes in class UI in the UI component because it is interacting with the user. I'll have an overloaded version of that, which is going to put integers on the screen. Okay, and we'll call that I guess. Okay, and it's going to do a similar thing, just cout I. And then I will have a method for getting input from the user. And all that's going to do is read a value from the user and return it. Okay, so these are three methods that are responsible for interacting with the user. They belong to this to a UI object, which is part of the view component because it has to do with interacting with the user. Okay, so that's why it goes. It's into this package, into this collection. All right, so let's take a look at the model, and this is going to be a simple storage entity. So we'll just call it class storage, and all it's going to do is store the integer. So we'll have a private variable in here. We'll call it int x. And so then I'll have, that's supposed to be a colon. So here I'll have a couple public methods, one for storing an integer. All right, we'll put that in x, and then one for retrieving what we stored. Okay, and we'll call it retrieve, strangely enough. So we'll return x. Okay, so that's its job. So class storage's job is just to store this one integer, and since it's doing storage, it's part of our model container, our model namespace. That's where it goes. Okay, now let's do the logic of the application. And remember, let's go back and take a look at our diagram. Now you'll notice that there's no direct communication between the view and the model. The controller facilitates that. It's a middleman. Okay, it has the logic, and it also passes messages, invokes methods on either of the other objects and passes data around and all that sort of stuff. So since it communicates with both the view and the model, it's going to need to have references or the memory address of those things so it can invoke their methods. Okay, so to make that happen, we'll have some pointers here. That's what we'll use. So to be able to talk to a UI object, we're going to need a UI pointer. But remember that a UI class is defined in the view component. Okay. Similarly, we're going to need a storage pointer. But remember, that's a model component, right? That belongs to the model. So then we'll have a constructor that is going to be responsible for putting the memory addresses of those two objects in their respective pointers. So we'll, oops, forgot to name the class here. We'll just call this logic. All right, let's fix that really quick. There we go. All right, so let's make that constructor. And we'll just call this _u and model storage _s. And then we're going to say u equals _u, so that way we can take the memory address of the UI object and as an argument here, and then put it inside of our local pointer here. And similarly with our storage object, we're going to do the same thing. Okay, so s equals underscore s. Now we're going to need the logic, the main logic for the program. And so I'll put that in a separate method, and I'll just call it doLogic. Right, so let's define that. And this is going to define the logic of the app overall. Right? Again, we're using a simple example here just so you can see the theory in practice in an easy to see way. So let's do doLogic, and this is going to be my algorithm. You know, ask the user for a number, store that number in the storage object, which is part of the model, and then retrieve that number from the storage object, which again, part of the model. And when we ask the user for the number, we're doing that using the UI object, which is part of the view. Okay, now once we've retrieved that number, let's display that to the user using the UI object, which is part of the view. So that's going to be my logic. So how am I going to ask the user for a number using the UI object? Well, I'm going to use that reference right there. Okay, I'm going to send it a message. I'm going to tell the UI, ask the user for a number. Enter number. Right? So that prompt, by that method call, is me passing a message from the logic object, which is a controller object, to the UI object, which is a view object. And so we're invoking this prompt right here. So we're telling it, put this message on the screen. Okay, and then after that, we're going to get the response. Okay, so you get input, right? And then we're going to store that in a local variable. Now, once we've done that, we're going to pass that on to the model, or to the storage object, which is part of the model. So we're going to use that reference, which is s, and we're going to say store that value. Okay. So once we've stored it, so by doing this, we send a message to the storage object, which is part of the model. And when we're talking about sending a message, we're talking about invoking its methods, right? So that value was passed as an argument to this n parameter, and then that n parameter got stored inside of x right here. Now I want to retrieve it by sending another message to the storage object through invoking its retrieve method. It says, hey, give me what you got. Okay, so we will do that right here. And I'll use a separate variable here just to show you that it's working. So we'll do retrieve. Nope, not on you. Sorry, s retrieve. Okay, and then we'll display that to the user using the UI object, which is part of the view. Which we'll do by saying su prompt. Here is the number you entered. Okay, and then I'll do u prompt, and this time I'll use the overloaded version, which is the integer. And then we'll just print a new line character on the screen. And that's going to be it. So let's test it. Okay. Make sure that it works. Let's see here. Oh, I actually have to instantiate all the objects. So no compiler error, so that's good. Now we need to create a UI object. We got to create a storage object. We got to create a logic object, and we got to pass the UI and storage object memory addresses to the constructor for the logic object. So let's make the UI first. Okay, and the UI is part of the view. Okay, then we'll make a model object, that logic object, which is part of the model. And then we'll make, that's storage object, which is part of the model. And then we will make the the logic object, and we'll give it the UI reference and the storage reference, which we'll call S here. Okay, and the logic is part of the controller. Okay, so that should be everything. Let's put a semicolon there, and let's try it one more time and see if it actually works. And then we'll trace to the code, and we'll go take a look at the the diagram again. So there's the enter a number. I'll type 8, and then you can see here's the number you entered, 8. All right, so let's trace that. Okay, view object, line 93, instantiated. Storage object, line 94, instantiated. Logic object, line 96, instantiated, passing the memory address of the UI and the storage object to it. Those memory addresses were stored in the local variables inside the logic object. Then we invoked the doLogic method, which has the main line logic. So that method sent a message to the UI object saying, hey, print this on the screen. Print enter number. So enter number was sent to this prompt right here, which was then displayed on the screen using that cout there. We went back, executed the next line. We sent a message to the UI object saying get the input from the user. So that happened right here. Simply had a cin statement and then returned the value that they entered, which was 8. So that 8 was returned and placed inside of this I variable right here. So from there, the controller object, this logic object right here, sent a message to the storage object, which is part of the model, and said, hey, store this value. Okay, so that value got copied right into here. And so then that got stored in the private variable in the storage object. And then the next thing that happened was that our logic object sent a message to the storage object saying, hey, give me back that number, retrieve that number that you're storing. Okay, so then we go back up to the storage object. It got the number out of its private variable, returned it. So then that got stored in this variable right there. And then our logic object here, which is part of the controller, sent a message back to the UI saying, hey, put this on the screen. Here's the number you entered, right? It's by invoking its prompt method, which is right here. Hey, put this number on the screen, which is just a cout statement. This is the number that you entered, right? And then we sent another message to the UI object through its prompt method. And this time it was the overloaded version because X is an integer. So this guy right here, and just put the X on the screen, you know, with the value, not in a literal X, but the value that was an X, which was 8, because that was copied into I, and then that was put on the screen. Went back here, and then we put a new line character on the screen by sending it a message saying, hey, put the new line character on the screen. And that new line character was passed as a string here and put on the screen. And that was it. So let's take a look, one more look, and then we'll finish off here. One more look at the diagram. So the action here actually began in the controller where it sent a message to the view and said, hey, you know, put this prompt on the screen, ask the user to enter a number, right? So then that was sent to the user. Then the user typed 8 in response, okay? And that 8 was then returned back to the controller, okay? And from there, that 8 was sent to the model through that storage method call. And then after that, the controller sent another message to the model saying, hey, give me that number back. And then that 8 was retrieved and passed back to the controller. And then the controller sent messages to the view saying, hey, prompt the users, tell them, here's your number, right? And then we gave them the number, and that got printed on the screen. And then we said, put a new line character on the screen. And so all that stuff got shown to the user. So you can see that the data and the messaging, it was all happening between model, controller, and view here. This was the flow, right? And the user was just interacting with the app through our view component, which was the UI object and the methods defined there. And the controller was driving everything. It had the mainline logic for the entire app. And model was just standing by to store data. You know, it was the storage guy in this triangle. Um, you know, that made up our app. Okay, so that's everything that I have for you. Hopefully you found that helpful. And as usual, if you're a student of mine, feel free to send me an email, stop by my office hours. Um, if you thought the video was useful, please consider giving a thumbs up. If you thought the video sucked, well, you got that thumbs down video as well. Please consider supporting the channel in multiple ways. We've got paid memberships for as low as 99 cents a month with additional perks. We got the super thanks button there. You can subscribe, leave comments. If you're an experienced developer out there, or anybody else, you know, in the comments, let me know how I did. Any suggestions on how I could do better in the future. Really appreciate it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.